let's start the webinar right now. So now I formally announce the beginning of this webinar. So good afternoon, everyone. It's 4:01 p.m. here in Brussels. I am Diego Borrero, and on behalf of the ICR facility, thank you for joining us today. I've seen that you have come from several countries and time zones. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of you. So today I'm very glad to discuss with two great panelists this topic of how gender-sensitive reforms and policies can help ACP countries boost their economies and, of course, tackle the devastating economic effects of the current COVID crisis. I should mention that along this series of online events that we have hosted here at the ICR facility, we have looked at the challenges and the opportunities of the current crisis from different angles, as you may have seen if you attended our previous online events. So talking about opportunities, we strongly believe in the principle of building back better. Building back better, a key principle about responding to the crisis with stronger social, environmental, and of course, human foundation. And today we are assessing and studying and discussing this topic about gender-sensitive reforms and how we can deal with this, how we promote this, how we identify this, and how policymakers and the private sector itself can benefit from them. I must say that this online event, as well as the other webinars from this series, are recorded and the videos are available for the participants, so this can be revisited in the future. So today I'm honored to share this virtual panel with two leading experts in this field, Susana Martinez and Lebrechtta Nana Oye Hesse-Bayne. Susana Martinez is the co-founder of Core Woman, an organization fostering economic empowerment for women and, of course, gender equality. Susana has a Ph.D. in economics and education from Columbia University and has authored several papers in these fields. Nana is the executive director of Shidaa Sustainable Development Solutions. She is now based in Trinidad and Tobago, and she's a social economist and gender expert. She's currently the board coordinator of the Caribbean Institute for Women in Leadership. So welcome, Susana, and welcome, Nana. So just before starting with the topic, a few words about the ICR facility. The ICR facility is co-founded by the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, together with the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development and the British Council. We are 4 implementing agencies: GIZ, British Council, Expertise Funds, and SNV. So what's the role of ICR? What's our main goal? Our main goal is simple, is to contribute to improve the investment climate in ACP countries, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. To do this, we respond to targeted technical assistance requests that may come from ACP countries, and we implement interventions at 3 levels. First, business environment reform. Second, business environment sustainability. And third, we support public-private dialogue processes and mechanisms, which is PPD, of course, a key instrument to inform, implement these reform and policies that can contribute for economic growth. So last but not least, we also encourage you to participate actively in this session. there is a very visible area in your screen right now on about questions. So we encourage you to actively participate by posting your questions there and your comments as well. Also, stay tuned because later in this session, we're going to explain how ACP countries, ACP participants to this webinar can actually apply for one-on-one clinics, one-on-one sessions with the expert, in this case, Susana Martinez. So just to move forward, well, thank you again to the participants from different places in the world. And thank you, Nana, and thank you, Susana. So now, Susana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diego, for the invitation. And I'm really, really happy to be here and contribute to this discussion. Since COVID started, we started in Core Woman to monitor the impact that COVID is having on women. And this is part of what we have learned and our concerns and our ideas and my ideas in order to include women in the reactivation. And in this case, we're going to talk about improving the investment climate through gender-sensitive reforms in time of COVID. And I want to say that as an economist, as a feminist economist, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is from the point of view also in the economy, not forgetting that gender equality is also a human right. But let's talk also about what it means in terms of money and for the governments. Okay. So let's start with the cause of gender gaps due to COVID-19. This is a study by McKinsey. Women jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable to this crisis than men's job. And we're gonna see more in detail country by country with a selection of countries, but in part is because of the sectors that are being more hardly hit by the crisis. Women make up 39% of global employment. That means if women are hardly hit, the economies will suffer. So we need to think about a reactivation with a gender component. But they account for 54% of the overall job losses. So we see that women are more hardly affected. This is a global estimate. So this is really interesting because McKinsey proposes an estimate of what would happen if we don't do anything and what happens if we address the situation. So they estimate that the global GDP growth would be 1 trillion lower by 2030 in 10 years if women are not considered as a central part of the recovery. And if we address this, instead, 13 trillion would be other if action is taken now to advance gender equality. So this is, we're talking about human rights, of course, but we're talking about money and about a lot of money if we don't address the situation because women are severely affected by this crisis and we're gonna see more why. So I am going to address this issue in 3 points. So first, the gender gaps that are increasing as a result of COVID-19. Second, the disruption and creative destruction, because of course there's destruction. This was a very famous phrase by an economist, Schumpeter. There's a destruction, but there's a creation. And we need to understand how that happens and how that impacts women and men in the long run and the short run. And then we're gonna talk how to build back better with gender equality with a very practical tool that everybody can use in order to understand the problem and see how to address the solution or the reforms. So let's start with the first one, the gender gaps that are increasing as a result of COVID. Oh, sorry, okay, so first, women are at the forefront of the response. In some countries, for example, I remember the number, Dominican Republic has 72% of the health personnel are women. In most African countries, it goes from 50 to 65%. Some countries are lower than others, you know, the very, very large region. In the Caribbean is also very large, but then we have more women responding to the crisis in the health industry. in the majority of countries, women are employed in sectors most affected by the crisis. So this is very important, and we're gonna see more details. But hospitality, tourism, hotels, restaurants have been hardly affected, and maybe will be affected for many years to come as behaviors change. And in a lot of those sectors, women are more likely to be represented, and we're gonna see some statistics about that. The third one is one of the most important, and I'm living it personally. Women are the most impacted by unpaid care work. I have a baby, a 15 months baby. My nanny had to leave, my husband and I'm very lucky because we could take turns. We are overwhelmed. We are really tired. A lot of women have had to leave their jobs for in the informal or formal sector, not only because of the lockdowns, but because it's not humanly possible to take care of the sick, the elder, the children, the babies, and children that are outside of school, even in considering the lack of connectivity and digital inclusion that most people in Latin America, Africa, the Caribbean have, and the way that that represents for women. Women are overrepresented in small business ownership, and small businesses were hardly hit. And this is true in Africa and in the United States, and the support hasn't come to them because they are too small to address the changes that they need. They are too small to get the loans that have been provided in the case when they have been provided, even in the case of the United States. Women in the informal economy and single parent families are especially vulnerable. In some countries, single parent families with a women head of household can be 40% of the overall households. Women are more likely to have informal jobs, so this really increases the likelihood of women suffering from poverty, which is already stronger among women. And very, very important, gender-based violence, particularly domestic violence, has increased as a result of the crisis. I'm not gonna touch a lot about on that topic because we want to concentrate on the economy, but of course, this affects the economy overall. And actually, I'm doing a study about how gender-based violence affects women's economic empowerment, and through health effects, through trauma and psychological damage and depression, women can have affected their productivity. Gender-based violence is very expensive for the governments because they have to provide all the psychological and health support to survivors. So this is also a very important thing to address and to monitor. In some countries, the calls to the attention numbers have increased by 200 and 400%. That means when they have a call number in order to report an abuse or an act of domestic violence. But what we have seen is that the hospitals or the police are not really responded to it because they don't see it as a very important thing happening when people are dying from COVID. And this is something that happened with Ebola in some African countries, where they thought that the only thing important was Ebola, and a lot of, actually more women died of due to lack of access to sexual health and sexual reproductive attention than of Ebola. So this is something very important. But I'm going to focus now more on the jobs and the economy. So for example, let's see gender gaps. I'm gonna always talk about Africa first and then about the Caribbean. And for Africa, I selected randomly different countries, and this is because I wanted to have, of course, 10 or 20 total, but it's very hard to present all the countries. So if your country is not here, maybe it's going to be on another. And for the Caribbean, I always present pretty much the same, but it's because the Caribbean has a lot of issues to have recent data. So we see, for example, here gender gaps in unemployment in selected African countries. We see, and this is very, very important, this 2019 before COVID. I just wanted to make the point about the gaps. because most of the countries don't have data post-COVID. So, for example, we see Libya, female had only almost 70% unemployment versus male 42%, which is pretty high. But we see almost like a 27% percentage point difference between men and female. We see, for example, in Sudan also, like a 16% percentage point difference between male and female. We see other countries where the difference is not so big, or for instance, Ghana, where men have higher unemployment. But the overall story is that women have higher unemployment than men. And if we have economies here, we also need that unemployment normally is measured by people that are looking for jobs. So a lot of people that are in the informal economy, which in Africa is 75% of the working population, are not looking for jobs, and women are more likely to be in informal jobs, which are more vulnerable. So let's see what happens in Caribbean countries. So we have also a similar trend, except in Trinidad and Tobago. We have our speaker lives there, so maybe she can tell us more details about Trinidad. But we see, for example, in St. Lucia, 10 percentage point difference in the unemployment of men and women. We also see that in Haiti with 14 percentage point difference. So basically the story here is women are more likely to be affected by unemployment, and we are seeing that to be true and even worse for COVID times. Actually, in English, there's already an expression, she recession, meaning the recession is really impacting women, which was not the case in the previous recession in 2008, because the most hardly hit were, for example, people in the financial sector, who tend to be mostly men. But this is a she recession. So how do we know this? And when you don't have recent statistics, which is the case of many countries in Africa and the Caribbean, you can see this by how women are represented in different sectors, because we have a lot of information about the sectors that were more hardly hit. So tourism, beauty salons, restaurants, domestic workers, sports and events. So you can calculate how many people are in that sector, how many women are in that sector, and then you will get a picture of how hardly hit have been women affected. So, for example, let's see some selected African countries who is in the service sector. And here we're putting together many categories, but this is the data that was available that we could compare by countries. But for example, we see in Ivory Coast, we have women, 58% of women are in the service sector compared to men. Men are more likely to be in the agriculture. That has also been affected, but less, because people have continued to eat. Actually, in groceries, the demand has increased. So the service sector has been more hardly affected than the agricultural sector, where in the case of Africa, there are more men in that sector. In Senegal, for example, we see almost 70% of women in the service sector compared to 47. So we start understand, even when we don't have recent data, we start understanding like, okay, so if the service sector, particularly restaurants, hotels, have been more severely affected, and women are more likely to be in those sectors, we know that this is a sheer recession. Women are more likely to be affected. What about the Caribbean? So we have seen these are very different economies. A lot of these economies are also heavily dependent on tourism. Tourism has been, as you know, really, really hardly hit. So we have actually women almost exclusively in the service sector. In the Bahamas, it's 96% of women versus 71% of men. In Trinidad, is 86% of women versus 58% of men. That's almost 30 percentage point difference. So we start getting the picture of how bad this is for women and for the economy. So, and something that makes it really hard to address is unpaid work, unpaid care work, and the difference between the time that women allocate to care activities versus the time that men allocate to care activities. And to define care activities is care of sick people. So traditionally, we have always had sick people, and women have traditionally looked after sick people, but now we have people with COVID. So add to that the historical gaps between the participation of men and women in care work. Then we have the care of the elder. In developed countries, a lot of the elder have had to leave their housing. This is not a problem in most developing countries because the elder live with their families, but they might require more support. If the elder used to care for children, for example, something that we have started seeing is that if they used to help the burden of women by taking care of their grandchildren or great grandchildren, now they are afraid because they can get COVID from their grandchildren, and the grandchildren don't even realize that they have COVID, but the old can die. So this is a huge thing. School closures, of course. So women became also teachers. Most of the people in Latin America is about half of the people in Africa. Can be, depending on the country, from 60% to 80% don't have digital inclusion, don't have access to internet. So school closures means it's not like everybody's with a computer seeing a Zoom class. A lot of the moms have had to become teachers and work with materials and do whatever they want, or just supervise the kids because they cannot study anyway. So the burden is really, really high, and we can see that there wasn't data for the Caribbean except for the Dominican Republic, but we can see here, for example, in Morocco, women put on average 20 hours um, of 20 hours of care work versus 3 for men, and we have in for example in Ghana 15.5 versus 4 for men. So and you can see the figure, like it's really high, and it is not as high, but is 1 to 3 the difference in developed countries. So, and this is going to explain something coming to this second part, very important about the solutions. But because when we think about the solutions, we also need to think about the burden that women are having. And for example, now I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna do online training. I'm gonna take this class. Well, I can't. I'm overwhelmed. And in order to reinvent yourself, you need training, you need money, and we have to consider those things also when we think about the solutions. But I'm gonna go back later to that later. So the second part, we're gonna talk about the disruption and the creative destruction. So there's a disruption, but there are things that are emerging from this crisis. And I am proposing this framework based on Borrero et al. Not that he proposes this framework, but this is a very recent working paper that analyzes what is happening with jobs for the United States, but it has a very interesting way of approaching the problem. So um, in order to understand the crisis and address the key reforms, we need to have these three aspects in perspective. So first, the crisis affects purchasing power and therefore consumption. That is the basic. A lot of economies know it. Everybody knows it. There's less consumption. People are going less, traveling less, buying less like luxury items. You don't need a car if you're on a lockdown. That we know. The crisis has increased unemployment. There's less purchasing power. So people have less money to consume, and those that have money to consume and being more conservative because maybe they don't know if they're going to have a job tomorrow. So that's the basic. But then the proposal is that we need to see also understand that the crisis is changing preferences and behaviors, and that those changes are here to stay. Many of those. What do we mean by changing preferences and behavior? I'm gonna go back to it later, but for example, maybe a lot of people already saw that it was great to eat delivery food, and they won't want to go back to restaurants because they don't trust them, and even after the vaccines. Or maybe people got and bought a huge TV and they're not gonna go back to a football match because why bother if you have a huge TV at home? So these are changes in preferences and behaviors that we need to understand in order to address those changes in the long run. Because if we only address the first one, then the reforms are not going to consider that things might never go back to where they were because of these changes of preferences and behaviors, particularly with the interaction with technology, which is the third point. The crisis is accelerating automation. We were obliged at any socioeconomic level to interact with technology, to use Zoom. Even I have some projects in Latin America with grassroots organization in rural areas, and people from really low income are accessing technologies and are using Zoom, even if we have to transfer money for the data. But before that, they were not forced to do that. So technology is changing the way we do things. So the proposal here is that we need to include those three on our understanding of how to address reforms to include women. So, and these came from a study of Borrero et al. That suggests that 42% of recent layoffs in the US will result in permanent job loss. This is huge. They're saying even after we come back in 1 year with the vaccine, they are not coming back. And they are not coming back not only because the families will be impoverished, but because behaviors change and because automation change what we need to do. So that is where the creation takes us, what we need to understand that would happen in order to make solutions to address those new opportunities. Okay, so let's go back to each one. Sorry. So let's go back to the purchasing power. The solution, of course, with the purchasing power could come from government transfers, which has been very, very common. A lot of our countries, developing countries, where we had already systems of conditional cash transfer. So some transfers to the poorest family could help to increase consumption. Public temporary work has also been used a lot during many crises and is being used now in order to provide income to families and increase consumption. Mining activities is also being used to reactivate the economies, and of course construction. The increased construction actually is central to relief programs. The thing is that a lot of these, if you think who does the public work, who does infrastructure work, who does construction, transportation, are mainly men. So what this reactivation could do in the short run and the long run is that we have women that are more affected in the service sector because they are more likely to work in restaurants, in beauty salons, in tourism, where the economy has been more hardly hit. And then the solution from the government comes from reactivating the economy on occupations that are traditionally male dominated. So we have a recipe for disaster. Women more affected, reactivation on masculine sectors. Loans and grants, when we think about companies, for example, loans and grants can help businesses to survive. The problem is that women are less likely to benefit from loans due to the size of their businesses and to social norms. And this is very documented in the literature. Women have a lot of barriers to access money. First, because yes, their businesses are less likely to be profitable, or because they're too small, but also because they lack the information to access those loans, and also because they suffer from discrimination. So this is true in every single place of the planet, and this was already documented of what happened with the federal government in the United States with the small grants that they gave. They ended up in the hands of big industries, male dominated. So this is not only the case of developing countries, this is everywhere. So what can we do about that to address this first point of purchasing power and consumption? So we need to include women in traditionally masculine industries and positions being developed to reactivate the economies. We can include women in construction. Not everybody is lifting heavy weight. Actually, there's regulations to limit heavyweight lifting. In developing countries, I know, for example, some cases in Colombia where one of the biggest companies that produce cement hired and trained women to drive their trucks, and they're actually awesome. They're doing better than the men. They have less accidents. They are more punctual. A lot of women are also in the public works, like organizing people, managing people, or those that are in the street, like controlling the traffic. So we need to do an effort when we use construction and public working infrastructure to include women. And change our mindset that, oh, those are only jobs for men. We need to create the necessary conditions to include them: safety, schedules, gear. And for example, in mining, and I'm now working on a project on mining, and it's very interesting because the problem is so deep that women that are in mining camps don't have the right gear to have safety within the field. So the helmets don't fit them, the gear don't fit them, the boots are not made for women. So we need to think, and we're gonna go back to that in the third. When we include women, is not only, oh, women can drive trucks. Of course, we need to train them because there's less women that drive trucks than men. But we need to think about their safety. There's a lot of rape, for example, in the public space for women. So take into consideration the schedules, for example, in addition to the gear. With regards to businesses, we need to provide lines of credits and grants specially designed for women-owned businesses. This is very important. And this way we would make sure that women are also accessing these businesses. And I'm going to transition to the second part, but just to make the link with this, it is very dangerous just to provide grants or loans without the right technical support, because a lot of these businesses will need reinvention. And that's how I go to the second point, which is the crisis is changing preferences and behaviors. So it is not only enough to provide grants and loans, but we need to think how the future will look like for these companies. There was not data for all countries. Actually, none of the Caribbean had data for these, and very few in Africa. So I took two examples, South Africa and Nigeria. So given the current economic crisis, 72% of individuals in South Africa are delaying purchases planned before the crisis. And in Nigeria, 92% of consumers have tried a new shopping behavior, for example, trying online purchases or calling. And we have observed a 30 to 65% growth in consumers that purchase online, which is huge. And 49% of Nigerians are paying more attention to hygienic packaging. So these are just some examples of how preferences are changing now and might be here to stay, and to stay because COVID vaccine is not going to arrive until probably in African countries, probably until the end of 2021. Developed countries already bought half of the COVID vaccines available, but also because in the long run we just get used to new things and just change our behavior, and that has implications on the businesses and on women's opportunities. So let's see, for example, we see if we look exactly at different sectors, this is in South Africa, we have seen that out of home entertainment purchases have reduced by 70%, restaurants 72%, tourism by 77%, domestic flights, of course, by 82%, and adventure tours by 86%. Instead, we're staying more at home, we're using more social media, we're cooking more at home, we're doing home improvements, we're watching more movies. So the question with this second point that the point that I wanted to make with this second part is, so first, yes, purchasing power affects consumption. Second, behaviors are changing, consumption patterns are changing. So we need to understand how it's going to affect the sectors where women are highly represented. For example, restaurants. Are all customers going to go back to restaurants? Are they going to be afraid of eating there because, for example, 49% of Nigerians are paying more attention to hygienic packaging? Restaurants have to adapt to these changes by accessing technology, by allowing more delivery and online purchasing, by having biosecurity rules. And this is not only in big restaurant chains in the cities, but also in rural areas. We have heard cases of people that had restaurants, small restaurants in rural areas that don't know how to address the biosecurity rules because they don't have the information or the training. So let's go to the third. The crisis is accelerating automation. This is really important. We thought, and we have been listening, the World Economic Forum and all the World Bank and all the big think tanks, automation is destroying jobs. It is very clear in some areas. So cashiers in supermarkets are disappearing little by little. Banks are putting these distribution machines, and there's less people in the banks. So we see it little by little, and it was estimated, and artificial intelligence is destroying a lot of jobs in admin jobs that can be done by machines instead of, so before you would need someone to have your agenda, and now you have Google having your agenda. This, of course, in formal jobs. But a lot of productivity things have improved, and sometimes we don't need the people that we needed in the past. This is in every single sector of the economy. But of course, there's a creation, so some leave, some go. The problem that is happening right now, and this is a point that makes Borrero, is that automation is accelerated due to COVID. So before we used to say in 10 years, 3 out of 4 jobs that would be lost in the 10 years due to automation would be female jobs. So that's super scary for me. That means out of out of 100 jobs destroyed, 75% are female jobs. That's huge. Now we're saying this is happening right now, and we didn't have 10 years to adapt to it. In the formal sector, women are more likely to be in positions and sectors easily displaced by artificial intelligence. So women are more likely to be in admin jobs. The crisis has accelerated our relationship with technology, and what was expected to happen in 10 years is happening now. And there are new high quality jobs, particularly in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, but these are highly masculinized. So the thing about automation is important to think it in the short run and the long run. So in the short run, and I'm going to start not for the first bullet, but we need to support women's transition through reskilling opportunities as certain technical skills become more important. So if, for example, now call centers are getting even more important, well, we need to train more people and more women to respond to that demand. Coding is something like we are seeing that one of the sectors that have been the least affected are sectors that have to do with technology. So not every single occupation with technology that is related to technology needs to have a bachelor's degree. So governments need to address that from reskilling programs, continuing education programs. Of course, there's a more long-run strategy, which is to incentive girls to study STEM programs, to create tools to retain female college students in STEM, because women are less likely to study STEM and then less likely to stay in the discipline because of social norms and lack of opportunity to succeed in their careers. And the last one is really important, and this is more short run. We need to create programs to promote digital inclusion, digital literacy, digital marketing, and sales for the most vulnerable populations. One of the problems that they are having in order to reinvent their businesses now is we're not asking everybody, oh, study STEM and go to college, but like now, what do I need now? Digital inclusion. A lot of people that had never had to do with technology now need to. Maybe they're used to, if they had a smartphone, they had WhatsApp, and they have been doing some businesses with WhatsApp, but we are seeing in our experience with entrepreneurs, they don't know, they don't have much digital inclusion. They only know how to work with WhatsApp, but they don't know how to develop digital marketing strategy, how to sell online. So this is something that can be addressed in the short run. So basically, this part told us that before I continue to the third part, this is just to show the gap between male and female in tertiary level graduates in STEM programs. And we see that overall there's more men than women. And the picture is very incomplete here because, as I was saying, after they leave to the labor market, women keep dropping out. So the big picture here is to take into consideration those three aspects when we take it and consider the reforms. First, there's changes in purchasing power, yes, and consumption. Second, there's changes in preferences that might be here to stay. And third, automation is here to stay, is accelerating the process of creation and destruction of jobs, and we need to understand where that is heading. So this third and last part, we're gonna talk some. We're gonna use a very useful tool in order to build back better after COVID with gender equality. So this is a tool that would allow us to see how we can address the problem. And of course, problems can be more complex, but it was something easy to remember and to use that everybody here can use to solve the problem. So first, we need to understand what are the main gender gaps that need to be addressed. So you define the problem at its gender gap and its possible gender gap. We need to increase gender data availability by establishing high quality and policy relevant gender gap indicators. It's very hard to find good data, but if you don't have, UN Women has also very good data. Sometimes it's not the most recent, but you can use that as a proxy to understand what's going on. Then we need to wonder what are the main causes. And for that, the framework that I just presented is very useful because it allows you to understand the problem in these three areas. So the changes are these, is this crisis or this loss of job for women simply a change in the purchasing power and therefore consumption? Or is it also a change in terms of the preferences and behaviors? Or is it a process of the automation and tech-driven changes? Or is it three of them, as we're going to see on a case study that I'm going to present? And finally, how do we address sustainable solutions for women and for the economy? So this is the activities, the reform, the policy part. We need to include women in the solutions and, very important, consider the specific barriers they might have access. A lot of the time, and I do a lot of consulting, and I'm also a researcher, people know, but this is gender neutral. Women can access. 60% of women are accessing my program. Like, it doesn't matter if you don't consider the specific barriers that you have, even if you have a gender neutral, meaning you are not discriminating women, they're not going to access, and we're going to see some of the reasons why they are not going to access. So, okay, so this table is really cool. I know that it has a lot of information, but I put a lot of information so that it was very clear all the things that you need to include in order to understand and propose a reform. So let's define the problem. So you need to consider the sectors, the subsectors, the type of businesses and occupations that have been heavily affected by the crisis. I'm going to go back to a very specific example. And then you need to consider the gender gap. So this is the problem. This sector and the hotel industry has been heavily affected. And then how many women or men are in the hotel industry and in which areas of the hotel industry. When post-COVID-19 data and pre-COVID-19 is not, when post-COVID-19 data is not available, you can use pre-COVID and make some inferences and relationships and assuming that it is way worse than what it was before. Then when you have stated the problem and the gender gaps, you use this three-way framework that I just explained in the second part to understand. Are these changes due to purchasing power and consumption? Are they based on changes in preference and behaviors, or are they on automation and tech-driven changes? They can be all of the above. And then you need to include women in the solution and take into consideration their barriers. Some examples of activities, of course, there's many more activities. I just cited some. You can do capacity building to local governments, chambers of commerce, companies. You can do technical assistance if you're an international organization. Lines of credit for women-owned businesses, as I cited in the previous example. You can do fast tracking high-demand areas like digital inclusion, digital literacy, digital marketing, online sales, biosecurity, things that are needed in the short run. So those are just some examples of activities. And then, in order to make it really gender sensitive, you need to understand the barriers that affect women. And we can speak about that for 10 hours, so I'm not going to go into deep detail. But you can, for example, chauvinistic social norms affect intra-household bargaining. What is intra-household bargaining? The negotiation power that women and men have in the household. Sometimes women would like to access a program, and this is really documented in the literature, but their husbands don't let them. So that is a barrier for many women, their husbands. Sometimes we need to include husbands in the equation in order to for them to understand that this is going to favor everybody and the well-being of the family. Discrimination by gender, age, ethnic group, sexual and gender identity. So it's not only that my husband is not going to let me, but if I go to a bank, maybe they're not going to give me a loan because I am a female and I'm 55. So they assume that I'm too old for that. So consider those, and we call that intersectionality. It's not only gender, but it's intersectionality between gender, age, ethnic group, sexual and gender identity. Time scarcity, I was saying. So if we are dedicating so many hours per day and per week to care activities, we have very little time to retraining, skills retraining, and many things. So consider that. Sometimes we have to do programs for women on Saturday mornings because during the week is just impossible. So that needs to be included into the equation. Safety concerns. So night shifts, adequate gear for women in mining construction, we gave that example, are very important. Lack of collateral to access credit. Women are less likely to have collateral to access credit. So loan programs for women need to consider that. In some countries, in actually English, former English colonies, is worse than in former French colonies because of the Napoleonian Code gave apparently more rights to women to inherit, but still in some of like Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana, in some countries, some of the legislation makes it really hard for women to inherit from the parents. So women are less likely to have collaterals, and that affects their economic opportunities, particularly in the rural sector. There's a lot of literature about that, but that needs to be considered for that specific issue. Skill gaps. Women are more likely to have technical and some social emotional skills that they need to find a job and sustain and reinvent the purchases. So, for example, something that we do with entrepreneurs is that we develop programs specifically designed to support women's barriers in terms of social emotional skills. What does it mean? For example, self-confidence. Women are less self-confident if they are less likely to have experience with negotiation, with clients. So we need to tackle those issues in order to support them to re-enter the labor force. And one example, very concrete example of how to use this tool. Let's see a case study of small business owners, which is one of my favorite subjects in restaurants. So this was one of the most affected subsectors of the economy, and one where women are more likely to be owners of restaurants. And these include also like very small, basic restaurants in the informal economy in rural areas. So first, we define the problem and its possible gender gaps. So, for example, 70% of small restaurants have closed during COVID-19. I'm just saying a number. What are the gender gaps? Among those small restaurant owners, 80% belong to women, and mostly women head of household. So then we stated the problem. It is not only about supporting women as a human right and as necessary for the economy and for their families. We're seeing that if we don't do something specifically considering the special needs of women, a lot of the restaurants will never come back. So this is a problem. Then you use the three-way framework to understand the causes of the short run and long-term strategy, which is the yellow framework that I gave in part 2. So changes in purchasing power. Well, individuals are earning less and being conservative with their non-necessary expenditures. Therefore, they're going less to restaurants. So you would expect that in some years, when purchasing power increases, they would start eating more in restaurants again, and everything go back to normal. But you need to consider number 2, changes in preferences and behaviors. Customers need to social distance outdoors, so you need to do something now. So open spaces, tables separated from each other. Do they have that space? Can they do it? Can they be outside? How are you going to do it? Even when the vaccine is ready, 20 to 40% of customers will not come back in person because they prefer delivery. Maybe they just got used to delivery and they don't want to come back. That means even when one changes back to normal, if it does, two tells us no, it's not going to go back to normal. These restaurants have to prepare for digital marketing, or if they don't have, if there's a place without internet, they have to have a WhatsApp system to get orders. They have to reinvent the way they deliver the product. Three, automation is tech driven, and tech driven changes. We could see, for example, 40% of the purchases will be done through apps and telephone. We saw that in the case of Nigeria data. So things are not going to go back to normal for restaurants. Therefore, our solution needs to include those three things. So one, yes, we as governments we can do reforms to increase purchasing power, but we're probably not going to change the new preferences and behaviors and the automation acceleration. So we need to think that when we think about the reforms, about the policies. So how do we include women, which is the third one, in our solutions and consider their barriers? So in the case of restaurants, we could develop training programs aiming at helping small businesses to reinvent their services. So digital inclusion. So if it is a very small service that never had even a computer inside, well, they should have. There's a lot of restaurants that I know, very, very small restaurants, even in rural areas, that actually use all apps that put together many restaurants because they don't have the money or the capacity to do that. So that's the way they have been doing, and it has been working better for them. Digital literacy, if they don't know how to work and use that platform, or even WhatsApp, if they're getting demands from WhatsApp, they're not going to be able to do anything. Digital marketing, of course, if everybody's in lockdown or restricted mobility, well, they're not going to know about your product or the fact that you reopen. And very important, biosecurity. And this is true for the formal and the informal economy. People are scared of going to restaurants because they don't know if they are sick, if they're having the right, if they're using touching food or sneezing on top of the food. So, and this can be very expensive for small business owner to address. So, part of the reforms and the policies to help, for example, that sector could be to address that training, assist with biosecurity measures for small businesses that lack information and resources to implement those measures. Sometimes it's not only about information, it takes money to implement the measures, and provide support to women to access a line of credit to support their online marketing strategy. So that's when I said just giving loans can make them have a debt and go bankrupt anywhere or close if it is an informal restaurant, because simply 2 and 3 tells us things are changing. People are not going to come back. They want biosecurity, and they want to be able to order by telephone or online. So we need to, if we do a loan system, we need to think also about all those things that they need in order to reinvent the product or reinvent the delivery of the product. So I think that this is a very useful tool that allows you to understand like the different steps. And I think that is very important to build back better with gender sensitive reforms. As I was saying in the introduction, if we consider include women in the reactivation of our countries or our economies, 13 million could be added to the global economy. More women will be able to support their families and leave abusive relationships, coming back to the first point that I made about increasing domestic violence. Economic empowerment is associated with many, many gains for the society, decrease dependent on social assistance from the state, improve well-being for the children, reduce reproduction of poverty among generations. More jobs for women could be added to the economy if key areas where automation is replacing robots for humans. So also the call for these is to start making reforms, thinking about automation and how that impacts women now due to COVID, because they're less represented in tech areas, because they're less likely to have digital inclusion and know about digital marketing and being in touch with the technology. So this is a call to Build Back Better with gender sensitive approaches, think it as a human right, but also as an economic necessity. And I hope that this framework and this presentation really help you to address and understand this phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you, Susana. And without further ado, please, Nana, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Susana. Susana gave us a comprehensive overview of what is going on in the ACP countries right now, looking at COVID. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Caribbean for about 10 minutes and give you some examples or ideas and that I believe governments, including private sector, can also contribute in building back better. So while the pandemic has affected a lot of sectors, as mentioned by Susana, another observation which we noticed in the Caribbean was also that women are being affected by COVID-19. As of May 2020, for instance, in Jamaica, we have 307 cases compared of women compared to men 204. The same in terms of Barbados, which was just 4 persons higher. We had 41 male cases and 44 female cases. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we had 63 female cases and 46. This is important. I'm just mentioning these 3 countries out of about 5 countries that had the data. This is important for us to note because if you're looking at building back better, if you're looking at productivity, and if you're looking at increasing growth for your country, and you find out that there is a particular group among men and women who are highly affected, this is going to then impact productivity. And the sectors which Susana mentioned, affected by COVID-19 in the Caribbean, especially the tourism sector, are mainly populated by women. So this is important to note that it's not only the fact that they work in those sectors, but they're also being affected mostly by the pandemic. Additionally, it's also important to note that she mentioned the employment rate, which I will not go into. Another issue which is important to note in the Caribbean is we have seen high numbers of intimate partner violence during the pandemic. For instance, Trinidad and Tobago experienced about 60% increase in violence against women, while some other countries experienced as far as 100. Now, this is also important to note is because while you have persons who are in the productive sector trying to contribute towards GDP and development, they are not only now having to deal with the issues that have to do with personal space, but also in terms of intimate partner violence, which will also hinder their productivity. I believe the European Union, through the Spotlight Initiative globally, is going to assess how much intimate partner violence or gender-based violence against men and women will impact the economy. So I'm looking forward to that research for our region to be able to make positive and contribute towards government discussions and policies on the impact of violence against women and productivity vis-a-vis the whole economy as a whole. The question then comes in terms of how then do we see the region moving forward? Now, for those who are on the webinar, you must remember that the Caribbean is a highly public debt-based region. In other words, we have very high debt. While we are associated as middle-income countries, we have very high debt, public debt, and of course, we have limited fiscal space in which to operate. This means that while you might be identified as a middle-income country, when it comes to productivity, when it comes to GDP growth, we're not doing very well. For example, I believe the IMF and ECLAC, which is the Economic Commission for the Caribbean and Latin America, the Caribbean office has actually envisioned that we are going to be seeing low growth rates in the Caribbean than we've ever seen before since the 1960s. What does this then mean? Because, for instance, we have 57% to about 75% decrease in visitor arrivals in 2020 because of the pandemic. So you're talking about a losses of about 222 billion US dollars to about 28 billion US dollars that the countries within the region now have to grapple with in terms of how they are going to make up for that loss. So if you're experiencing these sorts of numbers, or the data is reflecting these, telling the story, the question then happens, comes to mind, what do you do? But you see, we are not only are we highly indebted in a state that has very limited physical packages, we also are very vulnerable to disasters. So while you might rebuild in a year, a disaster might come and wipe away all your investments. So it's very important that when we think of building back better, we also think of building back better from a climate change perspective, in terms of building back better that not only buffers our economy, but also buffers our vulnerability. So what were some of the areas that we saw inequalities being highly exposed during the pandemic? We saw, for instance, the low skill, low productivity, and low paid work. These are some of the factors that we believe impact poverty in our region, and the inequalities. Unemployment, which was spoken of by Susana already, the external informal sector in some countries, weak social protection systems. Now, this is very important to note, because the social protection systems are what will actually buffer and support our most vulnerable. However, we have very weak social protection systems, so this exacerbates the issues that we have in terms of vulnerability and poverty and inequality. We also have a lot of single parent households. So imagine, Susana shared how, as a family, even with the support of her husband, they are tired because they have a young baby. Now imagine this in a single parent home with the same issues. Of course, it's going to be more felt within those families. We also have the issue of adolescent pregnancy, which we have to deal with, and also the urban-rural differential that we have. So for to date, in terms of social protection, governments have been able to support about 343 million US dollars in terms of payroll support. They have given grants to businesses, unemployment benefits, public assistance, and other relief through, for instance, like utility bills, etc., that has been provided. But the question comes, even if a country is with already limited fiscal space, is providing these social protection systems to help its citizens, what then do we do moving forward to be able to support that? We have to be able to address the poverty and the inequality. We also have to advance women's empowerment and their autonomy. We have to be able to look at building back with a climate lens as well, not only a gender responsive lens, but a climate lens, in other words, to support the region that is very vulnerable to disasters. And we have to think about the fact that not only do we strengthen institutions and businesses and private sector to support us, but we also have to address the issues of discrimination, the barriers that prevent gender equality within our economy. And these are the root causes. So for instance, while we might be able to provide loans or grants to women-owned businesses, if the root causes of inequality, the root causes that do not advance gender equality in the region is not addressed, the grants might not go anywhere. I did a project once looking at medium, small enterprises within the region. And of course, a young woman had gone to get a loan from a bank for her business. You know, she was very excited about it. But it became an issue when her husband found out about it. She had to return the money. Why? Because the root causes of the the gender-based violence and also the gender inequality was not addressed. So these are some of the things that banks and financial institutions have to consider and put in place, helping either civil society or the government to address these inequalities and these gender-based violence, as well as issues that really deter and advance gender equality within our region, making the space gender friendly such that the root causes of inequalities do not persist to hinder economic growth. In terms of, I'm looking at my time here, in terms of what governments can include to, what governments can do, sorry, to include women in the reactivation of their care work. In the Caribbean, the construction sector seems to be the go-to #1 sector to reboot the economy. Now, globally, this sector is very disaggregated. So governments have to think about how they are going to include women and create a more equitable space to share the gains that exist within the construction sector. So this could be in the form of, let's say, quotas where you're asking companies that have contracts to make sure they include a certain amount of women. Where it doesn't exist, have some sort of training program or internship attached to the project so that you can build the capacity of more women to bridge the gap. You could also look at probably, sometimes it's very difficult to have construction or infrastructure companies integrate gender into their programming or their projects. So it's important that these activities are contractual. In other words, the contractors do not have a choice. It's part of their contract, they have to implement it. And of course, this has to come with education and sensitization as well for them to understand what is going on. Governments can also bridge the gap within the region for the reactivation of their care work by looking to work with private sector in granting free access to Wi-Fi in vulnerable communities. We live in an age right now where, as Susana was sharing, in Latin America and Africa and the Caribbean, for some, going to school within this pandemic is not an option. In other words, there are a lot of children who are not going to school because their parents now or their single mothers have to negotiate between the money that they have, whether to use the money to buy food or to buy data. And the data is such that when you're going to school, it's a longer use of the internet, which they cannot afford because at the end of the day, they do not have food. I believe this is a great opportunity for the private sector and the government to work together such that vulnerable, poor communities have access to free Wi-Fi. That way the children can be able to go to school. Looking at also in partnering with persons who are the elderly within the community who have a little bit more time, such that, for instance, free up space for working parents who also have to be online for work. But if you have persons who are retired, who have the time now to come online and be the ones to monitor these children who are going to school, that will also assist in reactivation of the care work and also making use of all your citizenry. In other words, no one being left behind, and giving them also an opportunity to earn some sort of an income in addition to their pension. And as I said before, we have to address the root causes. Businesses and human resource directors also have to look at providing more flexible hours, creating opportunities for their employees, not only to work from home, but also they have to enhance their corporate social responsibility policies. So for instance, as I said, a company could decide that they're going to work with an elderly association to provide tutoring for the employees. That way you free up the burden of the employees to be able to focus on their work and be more productive. I agreed with Susana that giving grants to women is not only it's not going to solve the problem. Capacities of these women have to be built in terms of, one, how to even, sometimes even the application forms for these grants are so complicated. They look at it and they decide, I'm not even gonna bother. Secondly, how to even manage the grants when they get them, because the grants do not always, the grants, you have to report on them. Some of them are not familiar with the reporting system. Is this also an opportunity for private sector and government to come together and say, okay, we're going to, for women-owned businesses, we're going to partner with universities who are probably students in their third or last year to support some of these women-owned businesses, to help them either fill out the forms, have some sort of capacity building initiatives to support them. And they can also partner with these organizations as part of their internships to support them and also to build their capacity. There are a lot of opportunities for the ACP countries to build back better, and there are lots of conversations going on globally on this issue. And of course, with Susana's assistance, we're here to support and to see how best we can get the ACP countries to be more gender responsive so that we can build back better. No one is left behind. Everybody gets an opportunity to enhance their growth with the wealth that the country can provide. Just want to thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the questions and comments that you might have going forward.
Thank you very much, Nana. Thank you very much, Susana, for this very good two interventions. It has been very interesting to hear both your perspectives. I perceive that there are very common points you both discuss about common issues like tackling the roots of these gender inequalities. And I really like how you expose the challenges faced and how these are accentuated by the current crisis. But I also appreciate very much your policy recommendations, which are very targeted for this specific online event. So moving to the Q&A session. Let's start with a question, and you may feel free on this side who responds. But you mentioned a very sector specific challenge. That some sectors are more feminized, as you put in your slide, Susana, and that means that this accentuates that difference in how women are affected. Just an opening question: should governments prioritize sectoral reforms targeting those specific sectors where they identify these gaps already, and how this is mostly affecting women, or should it still prioritize vertical cross-sectoral policies?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I think that part of this understanding of what is going on comes from a sector perspective. Of course, sometimes governments want short-term gains. So I know that some countries are, for example, putting everything on mining, and mining can have an impact on GDP, but it is the impact that it can have on employment for male and for women is really small. So I think that that's when it comes a trade-off, like, okay, maybe mining and gold and metals, the price is exploding. So yes, that can have an impact, but you're not going to move consumption and the economy, because in some countries, mining can be 0.5% or 1% of the overall employment. So I think that if you can, both strategies would help. Focus on some GDP growth thanks to mining strategies, but understand that that's not going to move your consumption and your purchasing power, particularly not for women, because women are not represented there. And then focus on some sectors that have been heavily affected. For example, the service sector, the restaurants, the beauty salons, so on and so forth. So I think that and I think that African economies have, some are transitioning to a more service-driven economies. The Caribbean already transitioned there a long time ago. Pacific countries also are more heavily dependent on tourism. But I think that we need to think a lot about employment and not only about GDP growth. So a more sectoral approach would be better for employment, and then focusing on those that have been affected, and then on women because they have been more affected in those sectors.
Thank you. Nana?
If I may add, while governments might look at a unilateral approach of probably looking at their most productive sectors in the economy, this is good so long as they decide to do it equitably. In other words, governments have to bear in mind that they have made commitments to international conventions and international agreements that calls for gender equality. So let's say, for instance, let's say a government wants to use mining. However, we know that it is not a driver for high employment in the sector. It has to do it bearing in mind that there are deficiencies. No one is left behind. We have all signed on to the MDGs. We have Shidaa, which is a convention on elimination against discrimination against women. So it has to be done together. And so they can go that way so long as that is included. And then if you want to do it sector by sector, of course, then you have to look at who works in the sector. I like the toolbox that Susana presented. When that toolbox is really put into place and see who works there, because at the end of the day, I believe every government wants all its citizenry to be employed. You really don't want anyone being unemployed. So it's a matter of putting strategies and putting things in place if you're going to go sector by sector to make sure that everybody's included. So there is a win-win either or, but it's how you do it.
Excellent, very good point. Thank you, Nana. You both mentioned automation and digitalization, and you mentioned that automation is destroying jobs and particularly affecting women. So there are some opportunities like in STEM, but these are highly masculine. Is this an opportunity for differentiated policies regarding digital inclusion or digital entrepreneurship targeting women?
I think that there's a huge opportunity, and most developing countries are not even thinking about it. Sometimes I get into debates when I get people in the government, in the Ministry of Education, they're trying to solve all problems instead of looking at the future. So I think that now we're like, oh, half of the country is not working because there's not digital inclusion. We need to do something about it. I think that it needs to come from different, that's what I try to present, that like from the short run perspective, we need to understand not only that, oh, it's not, everybody doesn't have to study STEM programs, but the way we interact with the technology is changing the way we work, and it's changing the way we sell and produce products. That's what we need to understand. So if you are a restaurant in a rural area, maybe people are going to ask you something, the menu from WhatsApp. That's already interaction with technology. You don't have to be coding. So all those things need to be addressed from the grassroots level at any socioeconomic status level. And I have some examples because I am currently working with the Canadian Corporation on a project. This is in Colombia, but I think it's really relevant to other places. Like most of the women in rural areas are in the service sector. So we thought, I didn't get too much into it, but they're rural women, no problem. They are planting. No, most women in the rural areas are also in the service sector. Small restaurants, small sales here, and then their businesses are stopped because of COVID, and they're like, we don't know how to use technology. And you don't think how, but they also need technology in rural areas to sell their products. So a lot of what we have been doing is providing basic courses of how to use platforms, sending money in order to be able to connect to us to capacity building programs, and we have to send them the money for them to connect to receive the training. And we have seen firsthand how difficult it is for them to do everything. Biosecurity, they have no idea how to deal with anything. So it is also thinking about, well, long term, yes, we need more girls coding, and tech jobs are awesome and are gonna, but that's the formal sector. And for example, in Africa, I know that is only 25% of jobs. But also in the informal economy is how we understand, how we interact with technology on a day-to-day basis to improve our productivity. And that's when reskilling programs that focus on very, very specific issues can have a big impact.
Thank you. Before moving to Nana, because I'm pretty sure you have a very good point in that regard, I complement this question, not moving away from the digital field, with a question from one of our participants, a question from Anthony. Digital in post-COVID-19 can enable economic recovery. However, there will always be cultures and customers with preference for live restaurants. It is not only a matter of food purchase. How do you see this scenario? Asked Anthony. What strategy and capacity building for MSMEs and entrepreneurs? Thank you, Anthony, for that question. So maybe we can ask Hannah to start.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you, Anthony, for your question. I think going forward, it has to be a blend where we have to bear in mind that there will be a part of the population that still wants the interaction and not want to go fully digital. However, I believe somehow institutions and businesses have to be able to look at the digital option as very valid and post-COVID ready, and post-COVID as part of their strategy for post-COVID business operation. It has to be there. While there will be, so in other words, if you want to maximize on your market and not cut part of your market off, just as Anthony was saying, there will be groups of persons who still want the personal, who want an intimate one-on-one relationship. However, we also have to bear in mind that going digital is going to be the way forward for a number of people. And this can also be seen in the context of urban-rural divide, where the businesses are located. That also has to be taken into consideration, and who your target markets are, for your business, depending on where you're located. So if your market is mainly focused towards women, let's say you're in a rural area, how is that? And as Susana was saying, how do persons then interface with the technology? Because if it's sending mobile money, we know that's a big thing in Africa. Everybody sends mobile money. Everybody knows how to receive mobile money. But is it more complex, or is it more complicated than that? And I believe that is where the research needs to focus in terms of going forward, where the gaps are, where it is that businesses need to enhance their capacity to be able to maximize on a post-COVID business environment that meets the needs of their target audience.
Thank you, Nana.
Susana?
Anthony, I think that you're completely right, and that's why the three-way approach that I was presenting, I think it gives a really good tool to understand the different changes, but not to believe that everybody's go online or everybody's gonna go to the restaurant. I think that the percentages are gonna change. So that the example of the restaurant, I think, is great. If before COVID, 100% of your customers were going to be in the restaurant, now you're going to be on half capacity because they have to be social distance, and half of your customers, so 50% there, maybe the other 50% are going to ask for delivery, And from those are gonna want delivery from an app, so it's adapting to those changes. Not everybody, some people still want to go there, some people are like, oh, why bother, it's dangerous, I'm gonna be at home. So it's like understanding how the business will have to reinvent their services according to these preferences. And this will be the same. We're talking a lot with restaurants. Maybe it's a very easy example, but this is going to happen to many, many, many things and many industries. Like, are we going to go back to a stadium? Maybe like, why bother? I bought a better TV. No problem. I don't need to bother on a stadium. We already got used to it. So many things in the behaviors are gonna change the way we do things. That doesn't mean that everybody's changing. If already 30 or 20% of the people changes, we need to supply different services and a different way to deliver those services for these people, and then train the restaurants or the hotels or the small businesses to approach that new demand with, for example, online services and digital inclusion.
Thank you. You both mentioned your two previous interventions at the urban-rural divide, but also you mentioned, for example, in your case with digitalization, that the approaches could be similar. Anything to say about how these gender-sensitive reforms or policies could take into consideration these urban or rural differences?
Nana, do you want to start, or?
Okay, it has to start with the analysis, and I'll keep the toolbox which Susana presented is the initial stage of any gender responsive intervention. You have to look at who is within that space or who is within that sector. Where are they mostly concentrated? Look at what the barriers are. Look at what the challenges are for them being integrated. And definitely what works in a rural area might not work in an urban area. And that has to be, I think governments and private sector and policymakers have to be mindful of this. A one fit all will not work in both sectors. So you have to look at it from the urban side and you have to look at it from the rural side. I'll give a typical example. When you live in the rural area, right, and you're hungry, your neighbor might have some cassava or they might have some corn that they've grown, and they'll say, okay, here, I just harvested some tomatoes, have it, and you might have a tomato salad. When you live in the urban area and you're in an apartment by an apartment, nobody's harvesting tomatoes to give to you. You need cash to be able to go and buy food. And that's the reality and nature of it. So
I believe we're having some trouble with
policies and interventions that will work for the rural area will somehow, depending on the sector, be different than others.
Thank you, Nana. We lost you in your last point, but perhaps Susana can complement the answer.
Yeah, I think that one of the first things that we need to understand is forget the idea that everybody in the rural area is in agriculture. That's the first step. We just published a report about that, showing that at least in some Latin American countries, 65% of women are in the rural areas and in agriculture and in service sectors, and that is true also for many African countries. So when we started understanding rural from a different perspective, the less romantic, everybody plants rice kind of thing, we say, okay, what are the products or the sectors that are mostly represented in these areas? And then we need to understand the barriers, and that's why the toolkit is so useful, because the barriers are also different between urban and rural areas. Women and households in rural areas tend to be more conservative in terms of the social norms. So women are going to have more issues looking for a job or finding a job because of their bargaining power with their husbands, and that is very important. We need to consider those social norms and how they affect women. Women might be more likely to have more children. That increases their care work activities and then the load that they have in order to get any reskill training, for example. Sometimes when we support the governments to design programs, we even need to include care facilities when we're training women, for example, because otherwise you and I have been in some of those trainings. They're like half of them are with babies because it's the only way they can go, but that it really interrupts the learning process. So sometimes it's like, you know what, put money into childcare because otherwise you're not gonna have women, or if they go, they're gonna go with their babies. So it is about thinking about all these things that they would need, and the fact that the barriers might are overall the same, but are more accentuated in rural areas.
Thank you. Now that you both mentioned the toolkit and different approaches, let me go a little bit of script, and we can continue with the questions after this. But if my colleague can move the slide to the next one, I like to also introduce the participants to the clinics that we offer at the ICR facility as part of this the post work done through these webinars. Sometimes the webinar can be have a very broad approach or very global, and these clinics are also the opportunity to actually engage with the consultant, with the in this case Susana Martinez, as you have seen, is a thorough expert in this field, and you can send us an email to the email address there, icrfacility@giz.de, and request for or apply for one of these one-on-one clinics, which could deepen your knowledge in one specific topic, one specific tool that has been discussed here, or can dig further into your own challenges in your countries. Of course, the eligibility is key. Has to be a public or private organization based in an ACP countries. And please send us an email and we will get back to you in that regard. So this is an important part that I couldn't miss. So we can stay there so that our participants can take note of this slide and move forward with the questions. Let's talk about informality, which is a key challenge and one of the key issues that we tackle through business environment reform. According to UN Women, in sub-Saharan Africa, around 92% of employed women are informal, compared to 86% of men. Can you briefly elaborate about what specific policies with a differentiated business environment reform approach do you recommend or do you advise to tackle informality with a gender glance? Probably we can start with Nana with her vision from the Caribbean region. Nana, I think you're muted. Okay, well, Nana solves the...
Can you hear me? Right.
Yeah.
Definitely, you have to look at the informal sector from a gender lens. You have to look at the informal sector, looking at who is where are the men, where are the women? You know, what are some of the challenges that they have faced in that sector? And the informal sector is such that it's so wide that I believe governments now, together with private sector, have to look at how they're going to address the informal sector using some sort of state intervention to, I wouldn't say formalize them, but to put more structure into the informal sector. So yes, tackling it from a gender lens is important, and also addressing some of the root causes, because while persons are in the informal sector, they have a lot of barriers and discriminations that are already rooted in the gender norms and biases that exist within those countries. And I think for the informal sector to grow, this also needs to be addressed. Because while I might be the one, having a little mom and pop shop selling something there, at the end of the day, the income that I make might not necessarily go all to me or to meet the needs of the family that I want to meet. So looking at these policies or looking at the interventions from a holistic perspective is key. We cannot deny that at all. And government has to work closely with the informal sector to put some sort of structure in place. So it could be associations, making sure that while they are informal, they are part of an association, that way targeted interventions also can go to assist them while they're all scattered everywhere. That's comparatively. I don't know if you have anything to add, Susana.
Interesting.
Well, solving the informality problem has been always a challenge. Imagine now in times of COVID. What we know is that, well, women are more likely to be in informal jobs. And in part, economists suggest that that is because they prefer to be in informal jobs. So, of course, feminist economists like, no, don't say that. Women face some different barriers, and one is, for example, flexibility. So, informal jobs provide, if you have the chance to get a formal job, meaning you have the education and the skills required to access and can go through the legal barriers to access a formal job. Some women might prefer to stay in the informality because of flexibility, because of the care work. So that's something when we talk about gender and informality before times of COVID, now it's more complex. We say that the barriers are not only legal, but that we need to address the flexibility. So I think that the fact that a lot of the people, particularly formal sector, have been working remotely, for those whose job allowed them to work remotely, maybe now women can have more flexibility, and that can allow at least that sector of the population that could have the opportunity to be formal because they could be working from home. But that can be a very small, I would say 5%. So that wouldn't have like a huge impact on overall employment. But I think that that can change a little bit behaviors. I think that another thing is has to do with technology, the skilling in technology, how we can increase the number of women in the formal sector by reskilling and making them making their skills complement better with technology. I think that that can open a lot of opportunities for women. Of course, that depends on so many things about the economies and the industries that are available and the local formal jobs is very complex. But we could close at least that gap with one of the proposals that we have been talking about here, which is reskilling training, short programs that allow women to complement better with technology and increase their productivity. Because, let's say in mainstream economics, you think that output productivity is one of the most important measures in order to like evaluate whether a person is in the formal sector and the informal sector, so that would increase it. I think that's something very important to improve the quality or informal workers is to work with value chains. a lot of the times we focus on the industry. So for example, a mining industry, who is in the field taking the coal or do whatever, and we don't think about all the people around that mining that has jobs that are related and that are informal. People that live in the community, people that produce food for the miners. So I think that it's very important to work with those big companies that produce formal jobs so that they work with their value chain and they promote well-being to the communities that live out of those value chains that provide these big industries. And some way, like Nana was saying, is promoting associations, for example. Sometimes it's hard to formalize them, whatever that means in each country, meaning like having access to health insurance and a contract and so on and so forth. But they could really, these associations can provide some of these benefits without them being necessarily included in the company's personnel. So accessing health insurance, for example. So I would say that that would be some of the thoughts, but it's a very complex problem. It was a very complex problem before COVID. Now it's even more, and informality is increasing.
It is true, and sometimes informality it's still the way for several families to obtain their income, and particularly women, as we could see with the data from UN Women.
Mm-hmm.
You both have mentioned the word behavior at least 3 times through this panel. We sometimes when we deal with business environment reforms with clients in governments, there is a perception that business environment reform, it's a reform, it's a legal reform, it's carrot and the stick type of measure, and sometimes we and policy makers underestimate the value and importance of actually alternatives to regulations. We talk about changing regulatory frameworks, etc., but we are not. We sometimes we forget that the solution is beyond the regulation or outside the regulation or in absence of regulations. But thinking about alternatives to regulations, how about or is there any lessons that we could get from behavioral science? I know Susana and I were having a discussion before this talk about behavioral science and the increasing importance in policy making. Any examples on how behavioral science can help tackle these issues, specifically because some of the issues cannot be solved with rules and regulations, and they're rooted in behavior?
Yeah, I love frameworks. So we also have Core Woman. We use a lot of framework, also 3 areas of this framework where we tell our clients, governments, so on and so forth. Okay, if you want to reduce gender inequality and promote women's empowerment, you need to see these from the structural reasons. That includes laws and regulations. I'm not a lawyer, but I know that they provide opportunities to do certain changes. But that's as long as it goes, at least for in in my view, and with all the evidence and things that I have read. It creates opportunities. It creates a framework to know that that exists, but that doesn't change behaviors. So the second part that we promote and that we measure in a lot of our studies and consultancies is exactly what are the behaviors that need to change at the government level, policy level, company level, in order to promote this gender equality and women's empowerment. For example, if I bring the example of a company, the company might have a written culture like, oh, we value diversity and promote women's empowerment. And then you see all men doing like mansplaining and sexual harassment and affecting women's opportunities because of micro aggressions. So then you need to change those behaviors with different parts of interventions, because the laws and regulations or the norms of that company are not necessarily influencing the fact that those men and women were brought in a society where social norms tell you that if a woman speaks strongly, is a bad boss, and if a man speaks exactly the same, is a good boss. It is the unconscious biases, it is the way the media portrays women, and it is the way we are going to portray deal with women in the day-to-day. There's, for example, evidence that women in the same hierarchy level, women are more likely to be given like housekeeping tasks, meaning do the PowerPoint because you design so nice because you're a girl. And guys are given more strategic tasks that are more easily, that will make them to be promoted more easily, such as go and make this strategic plan and present it to the client. So who's gonna get promoted? The men and not the women, because, well, she's doing a PowerPoint, she's doing strategic planning. So that comes from the behaviors and the unconscious bias of why you think that women are so nice to do PowerPoints. Just a little parenthesis, I gave one of my data guys to do a very pink, purple PowerPoint, and I was like, you're gonna see, we're gonna do counter gender stereotypes. So that we need to, there's a different intervention to change behavior so that unconscious bias and discrimination and microaggression don't affect women's opportunities. And then there's the third point, which are women's barriers. We grow in a society that told us, don't take risks, don't speak loud. If you are too strong, they're gonna see you as a bossy person and not as a leader. So we also have internal barriers that we have to work out. It's not our fault, it's the society we grow in. So we also have to work on those barriers. If we only do the regulation part, nothing is gonna happen. So beautiful, and that I am very critical of some of the rankings and measures for gender equality that only go to the laws and regulations, because it's nice, but it doesn't mean that the behaviors of the people really relate to that regulation. Then we need to intervene with behavioral science evidence, like I just cited a paper about behavioral science. How are we going to change really those behaviors? And it is really difficult. I'm not saying, and there's many techniques, but what evidence of unconscious bias training for many, many years in the US is saying is that it's very difficult. And then we need to work with women's individual barriers so that they negotiate, they ask for, they self-promote. And by doing that, that other people around don't see it as negative.
Thank you. Nana, anything to add in that behavioral space?
Definitely. As I always say, is changing behaviors come over time. It doesn't happen overnight. And when you're looking at gender equality issues, that's really what you're trying to address, changing people's behavior. And I agree with Susana, at the legislative or policy level is not going to cut it. It has to be implemented. In other words, if you have laws, if you have policies, there has to be an implementation plan. How are we then going to take this policy and trickle it down so that the staff within that organization understand what it means? It might mean that you need to get gender equality champions who are going to work with the different departments to see what the organization, if we take an organization as a context, what does it mean then for us to say we have a gender policy that promotes equality? How are we promoting equality in HR? How are we promoting equality in operations? How are we promoting equality in sales? How are we promoting equality in marketing? This has to trickle down, bearing in mind that you have to start. And once you start, you might not get the results you want initially because behavior change comes over time. But with time, you will see the results. And as I always tell people, when you look at the definition of gender, it's context specific and changes over time. That means years ago when women couldn't drive all around the world, Today, a lot of women are driving. Some people would not understand it who used to live back then, but we are living to see it. So it has to start with the implementation of what the regulations, all the policies mean to the people. In other words, the change they envision. And once that is, there's an action plan to it and it's worked through, results will come at some point. Not initially, not the first year, might not be the second year, but probably third year, fourth year, fifth year, you can see some results.
Thank you, Nana. A very interesting point about those implementation gaps that we see between the idea and the original program and what happens in the chain, and how policymakers need to actually get to until the end of that chain to really promote sustainable behavior.
And something
regarding yes.
Diego, just to add something there, and it is like when we implement, and this is something that I found very often in our consultancies, a lot of the programs manage to inform. And there's something very different between informing and changing behaviors. So we have like another tool where we say, okay, is this informing? Meaning, oh, I know about that regulation, about that law. Okay. Did I create consciousness about the importance? Is this really necessary? And this is how it needs to be done. Am I changing my behaviors? Those three are very different. And it depends on the type of intervention, how you implement that intervention.
A very good point, which actually connects with another question, which is you mentioned informing about these policies, and sometimes informing and never informing is enough. This leads us to the question on public-private dialogue, which is one of the key areas that we support to inform, to implement the reform processes. In this case, you mentioned that you must include the women, and I'm quoting I think Nana, that you must include women in your solutions to understand the barriers that are particular to women. So what is the role of public-private dialogue to foster this better informed and build reforms and policies with a gender lens? And just to complement the question, do you know of any public-private dialogue platforms or processes that have been successful at this in ACP countries?
Okay, that's a very good point. Currently, I don't know of any that have been successful, but I can do some research and get back to you on that. But what I do know is it is important to include women, yes. And when I say include women, it's not just having women present, but it's having women contributing and sharing in the information and providing feedback. Because a lot of institutions sometimes say, oh yeah, we had a very good dialogue. There were lots of women there. But at the end of the day, if they did not contribute tangibly to the discussion, then you might as well say you had no women there. You know, so it's important that when you want to include women, you include women who can also make contributions, who are voicing their issues, their concerns to address whatever issue that is at hand. It's also important that you have different groups of women, not just women, you know, depending on the issue that you're addressing. You know, you have to look at women not as a homogeneous group, but also the fact that you might have women who live in the rural area, you might have migrant women, you might have women who are faced with various vulnerabilities. You have to include these groups of women, and it all depends on what issue that is being addressed, so that you get a holistic point of view. And I must say, we're just saying women, 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 but we have to also remember that we also have to include the men there, because gender equality is a space that cannot exist without men.
Very good point, Nana. Actually, it's an interesting quote to finalize this webinar. Susana, I saw you taking some notes. I'm pretty sure you have a reaction.
Yeah, I had some ideas. Yeah, I know of certain initiatives promoted by international organizations, the IFC, for example, from the World Bank, the gender parity initiative from the Inter-American Development Bank. I don't know if another international organizations are doing, but these and the World Bank one is global. What they do is that they promote gender parity initiatives where they link the governments with companies. And then companies compromise to make certain changes. They measure themselves in terms of how they are in gender equality. The best tools include the norms and regulations part, but also their implementation initiatives. They have some results, they have some action plans, and they compromise. I know that worldwide the mining sector is taking the leadership on this. It's very interesting because it's a very masculinized sector. I'm working with that sector right now, and that's why I'm bringing back the mining sector. Women are a minority in the mining sector and are predominantly in administrative areas, but the mining sector worldwide is really working with governments to improve the lives of women and the gender equality within the company, but also the lives of women that belong to the chain value and to the communities they impact with their mining activities, positively because they generate some jobs, or negatively because they damage the environment. So I think that those are very interesting examples to look at how the companies are compromising with governments in order to make certain changes that benefit women that work with them and their communities.
Excellent. Well, I think we are reaching at the end of this presentation. Time flew, actually. It was a very interesting exchange, and I feel honored to have shared this panel with both of you, Nana and Susana. Thank you to all of our participants that stayed there until now. Thank you very much. Just don't forget to take note about the clinics. Don't forget that this webinar has been recorded and it will be accessible afterwards. Then also you have a fact sheet to the ICR facility that you can download right now from your GoToWebinar panel, as well as this presentation. So if you have any further reactions, any further questions, just send us an email or any potential requests for the clinics. So thanks again, Susana and Nana. I've been very happy and I've learned a lot from you. I'm pretty sure that our audience as well.
Thank you, Diego, so much for the invitation. Thank you, Nana, for discussing with me this great panel.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here as well.